Did you know that in 1937 there was an explosion in a Texas school that was so bad that Adolf Hitler paid his respects? Natural gas leak enthusiast Professor Jelly here, and today we dive into the New London school explosion on this episode of Weird Wikipedia. The Great Depression, home of grainy black and white photos of sad, malnourished Americans. It was also home to a very well-to-do school district in Texas. See, unlike the rest of the poor sods in Oklahoma, the proverbial Texas tea had just been found in Rusk County, Texas, which produced a great deal of money for the people in the county, and consequently some of those sweet, sweet tax dollars went into funding the school district. And by funded, I mean funded. In 1937, the city's taxable value was in the $20 million range, which is over $400 million in today's money, and they funneled that money into producing what was at the time the richest rural school in the country. These guys would have had new iPads like every semester. Those Kahoot games are going to have zero lag. The London High School, which was the new high school in New London, but was just apparently called the London High School, I don't like it any more than you do, was constructed in 1932 at the cost of $1 million, which is about $20 million in today's money. Its football team, the Wildcats, a play on the term wildcatter, which is a name for an oil prospector, had one of the first stadiums in the nation to have electric lights. But not all of these technological advancements would end up being a good thing for the unfortunate school, as what had made the school rich would soon turn to disaster. So in the design phase, the school board had overridden the architect's original design of a boiler system to heat the structure, and unknowingly set the pieces for disaster by opting for 72 gas heaters throughout the building. And at this point I need to explain something about oil extraction at the time. During this period, the natural gas that was extracted with the oil was just considered the waste product and was just sent to be burned off. And because this gas was of no direct monetary value to these oil companies, they didn't particularly care if any entrepreneurs, came up and hooked their line into the waste gas line to fuel their heaters. It wasn't explicitly authorized by the company, but they also just didn't care. And one of these penny pitchers happened to work at the New London School Board, who decided to cancel their gas contract and instead just hooked directly into the Parade gasoline residue line. Now this may all sound like a fine and dandy way to save a few bucks, but as you may remember from your most recent King of the Hill binge, natural gas has no natural smell in it. The smell that you associate with like propane and such is placed into the gas so that you're able to tell when there is a leak. That smell was not present in the residue line coming from the Parade gasoline company. And so for an unknown amount of time, gas had been leaking from the waste tap and building up inside the enclosed crawl space that ran the entire 253-foot length of the main school building's facade. Now, a few of the students had been complaining about headaches, but this was considered more of a whining issue. Boy, take a few of these morphine drops and stop your yapping and get on with your learning. It's 1937. Ain't no such thing as a headache. The buildup came to a head on March 18, 1937. While the exact spark is impossible to exactly determine, the most likely culprit was an electric sander that was turned on at 3:17 p.m. Sadly, just 13 minutes before the whole school would have been dismissed. The article says, reports from the witnesses state that the walls of the school bulged, the roof lifted from the building, and then crashed back down, and the main wing of the structure collapsed. Survivors in the building claimed that the lockers embedded in the walls were thrown at them by the blast. Others were picked up by the force of the explosion, and the plaster and mortar formed a white haze. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton concrete block was thrown clear of the building and crushed a 1936 Chevrolet parked 200 feet away. The only positive thing about the explosion was that it was so loud that it was heard over 4 miles away, immediately alerting everybody of the disaster, which soon summoned everybody from parents, the nearby oil workers to come and help clear the rubble. When the true magnitude of the disaster got out, it was met with an equal response from the public, and you start to get many stories of heroism from the local community trying to mitigate the disaster. People working all night to find survivors, drivers throwing out the bread in their trucks so they could serve as an ambulance, and people leaving their stores unattended so they could help the efforts. The governor dispatched the Texas Rangers, Highway Patrol, and National Guard. Doctors, nurses, embalmers, soldiers, sheriffs, and even Boy Scouts helped in the search and rescue. A hospital was opened ahead of schedule to deal with the wounded, and dozens of makeshift first aid tents and impromptu morgues filled the surrounding area to deal with the massive amount of casualties. In a cruelly ironic twist, one of the items that was dragged out of the rubble was a blackboard that read, "Oil and natural gas are East Texas's greatest mineral blessing." The reporters that showed up to cover the event were generally directed to physically help the disaster relief efforts. And one of those reporters was a young Walter Cronkite, you know, the most famous reporter of all time, the guy who covered World War II and the Nuremberg trials, the man who announced that President Kennedy had been shot on live TV, and honest to God was quoted decades later saying, "I did nothing in my studies nor in my life to prepare me for a story of the magnitude of that New London tragedy. Nor has any story since that awful day equaled it." The official number of people estimated that were killed in the explosion is 294, but the actual number of victims remains unknown. However, it should be noted that the vast majority of the dead were from grades 5 through 11. Thankfully, the younger students had been let go early that day, but these were children, and there were hundreds of them dead. And some were in a completely unidentifiable state, with horrifying stories of parents fighting over remains that may have been their child. The aftermath of the event also became seismic, as it was later known as the day that an entire generation died in Texas. There were so many killed in the disaster that an entire plot of a nearby cemetery was filled just with victims from the explosion. The school superintendent, even though that he had also lost a son, a nephew, and a niece in the explosion, was sadly turned into a scapegoat by a lot of people in the community and was eventually forced to resign his position. The explosion was also studied by the United States Bureau of Mines, who concluded that the gas line connection was to blame. And shortly after this conclusion, Texas legislature passed a law requiring that a smell be placed into natural gas so that a leak could be detected. Amongst the thousands of letters that poured into the community after the disaster was a letter from Eleanor Roosevelt expressing her sympathies, as well as a telegram from a certain Adolf Hitler, who had just become leader of Germany, something that certainly would not become extremely awkward in the very near future. After 10 days of mourning, the standing gymnasium was converted into a jury-rigged school for the rest of the semester, and a new school was built in 1939. There currently stands a memorial for the explosion on the grounds of the old school. Today, the New London school explosion is one of the least remembered but deadliest disasters in world history. There have been many reasons pushed forward for the lack of publicity surrounding this disaster, but I think it simply just comes down to the nature of the actual explosion. There wasn't any malicious human behavior that led to this disaster, just bad safety precautions. And because the majority of the victims were school children, whenever reporters would come to try and talk to the community about the disaster, residents just would not talk to reporters because they would much rather just push the event out of their mind. Something that makes a lot more sense when you consider that essentially everyone in that town knew or was related to someone who was killed in that explosion. However, public knowledge of the event has started to spread in recent years, with news reports and documentaries coming out about the subject. I personally feel that these remembrances need to happen so that such disasters do not happen again in the future.